75th anniversary of VE Day. V for Victory, E for Europe. Victory in Europe Day. The first VE Day was celebrated on the 8th of May 1945. Thousands of people celebrated. After nearly 6 years, World War II in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had surrendered to the Allied armies. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister in World War II. Many millions of people had died, both soldiers and civilians. Troops from over 20 countries were fighting, some to take over other countries on Hitler's orders, some for the freedom of all. Today I'm going to tell you about someone who celebrated the very first VE Day, not here in the UK, but in Belgium, a country in Europe. This is Margaret Jane Roberts, who was born in Brook Street in Hartlepool, a town in the northeast of England, on March the 19th, 1922. She was the eldest of 11 brothers and sisters, who called her Jenny. Margaret left school when she was only 14 years old, and when she wasn't working as a bus conductress, she loved skating at the Queen's Rink. This is where she met Fred Bell, who enlisted as a soldier in 1940. When she was 17, Hitler commanded his armies to invade Poland, so the UK declared war on Germany. What year was war declared if Margaret Jane was 17 years old? Between January 1940 and March 1943, Hartlepool's shipyard and other industries were the target for German bombs. 5,745 buildings were damaged. And in just the summer of 1940, there were 147 air raid warnings. On the 2nd of May 1942, Margaret Jane Roberts married Fred Bell, and they lived in Hope Street. 6 months later, he was deployed to North Africa with the Royal Engineers. Fred was injured in the final battle of the Desert War on the 13th of May 1943. He died the next day. On the 14th of May 1943, Margaret became a widow. She was only 21. In wartime, the sad news of a relative's death came via telegram. Before people had phones, a telegraph was used to send long-distance messages. These were then typed and delivered like a letter. Margaret wanted to use her grief for good, so she wrote to Mary Churchill, the Prime Minister's youngest daughter, to ask what she could do for the war effort. Mary had enlisted in the Auxiliary Territorial Service when she was 19 and suggested Margaret do the same. 2 months later, Margaret passed her medical for the ATS. The Auxiliary Territorial Service was set up by King George VI in 1938 for women who wanted to serve their country. During the war, Margaret did things she never expected to do. She travelled far away from Hope Street in Hartlepool. She never spoke of her wartime sorrows and adventures, but luckily for us, between 1943 and 1945, she kept a record of her life in photographs and made a photo album. This red book is the photograph album that she bought in Brussels in 1945. Inside are 145 photographs and over 100 signatures from friends and colleagues. How old is this album? Do you know anybody as old as this? They might have war stories too. Look carefully at the gold outline on the front. It is a drawing of a statue called Mannequin Peace. What is the little boy doing? You can still see this statue in Belgium's capital city. What is the capital of Belgium? The gold words are not English, but they are similar. Souvenir de Belgique. What do you think they mean? After training in Pontefract, Yorkshire in 1943, Margaret was posted to Dartford and Hove in Kent and other unspecified UK locations. This is Private W288404 Margaret Jane Bell's Service and Casualty Form, which details all of her training and postings. New recruits did basic training at army camps, where they lived in huts, learnt to take orders and march, and had to keep the camp clinically clean. After 4 weeks, they took written and practical tests to find out which jobs they were best suited for. Margaret volunteered for service in the field of war on the 18th of November 1944. This meant she would travel to Europe, where fierce fighting was still taking place. On New Year's Eve 1944, Margaret Jane Bell embarked on a troop ship with the 155th Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment of the Royal Artillery. They sailed across the Channel to an unknown destination. She disembarked in northwest Europe. Although her service records only state field of war, we have learned where she served as a Private Class 2 from her photographs. Her operational duties were as an anti-aircraft operator with the Royal Artillery, who were a regiment that was part of the campaign of the British Army of the Rhine, pushing the Germans back to Berlin. Anti-aircraft crews watched out for enemy aircraft, tracked them with radar, picked them out with searchlights, and aimed the large anti-aircraft guns. This is a testimonial about Margaret's service, written and signed by none other than Mary Churchill. This auxiliary has had various technical experience during her time as an operational anti-aircraft operator. She has served with the regiment overseas where a high standard of work and conduct is required. Margaret was in Belgium from the 1st of January 1945, and on VE Day, May the 8th, 1945, she was on the Antwerp airfield where she served. From her photographs, we can see what she and her colleagues were doing that day. Here they are celebrating. Later in the week, they held a dance. And when they had leave in June, they went to Antwerp and took a trip upriver on the Blue Peter. Although the war was over, Margaret did not return to live in the UK until her tour of duty was complete, on the 4th of September 1945. On her return to Hartlepool, she went on to marry, have 4 daughters and 8 grandchildren, including me. Her military history sheet shows that she was awarded 2 medals. The France and Germany Star is awarded for serving in the field of war. The War Medal is awarded to servicemen and women who served in the 1939 to 1945 war. She claimed neither of these medals during her lifetime. Today we have learnt about VE Day and its history, so that on May the 8th, 2020, you can celebrate the 75th anniversary of VE Day with a VE Day party. You could bake a cake, blow up balloons, make bunting, dress in red, white or blue, or all three. Sing God Save the Queen and celebrate those who gave or risked their lives so that we could be free. And while we are celebrating, we must remember that the restrictions we are under today are nothing compared to those faced in World War II.